Look, it's a pleasure to have with us today, and a privilege really, to have David Bowman, Professor of Pyrogeography and Fire Science at the University of Tasmania. David received a PhD in 1985 and a Doctorate of Science in 2002. His fire research is internationally recognised and since 2019 has been ranked in the top 1% of cross-disciplinary research globally. In 2020, he was the winner of the Tasmanian Government's STEM Communication Excellence Award. And Professor Bowman points out that fire is an essential part of nature, and so we need to adapt our management of fire in order that we can sustainably live alongside it. So what tools do we use to mitigate fire's worst effects? And in a warming world, how do we coexist with fire? Would you join with me in welcoming David Bowman?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for giving up some beautiful sunshine, summer's day. So it's sort of a really nice thing to be in this lecture here. It's a sort of an origin story. John and I did geography together a long time ago. And the field, as I'll explain, of pyrogeography did not exist then, and I had no idea that I was going to be basically playing a big part. Oh, it's interesting. The font has changed. But anyway, that's maybe it looks more sort of hipster-like that. So I'm going to I'll give you a summary. It's very wide-ranging what I'm talking about, and so you may get lost. So probably have a summary in your mind of what I'm trying to talk about. I'm going to talk about firstly the global fire crisis, why there really is a global fire crisis and some very serious consequences of that, which I'll explain. Then I'm going to talk about pyrogeography and the fire centre that I've set up, and remarkably timely given the global fire crisis, which sort of, I was thinking about these things well before we fired the starting gun on acknowledging there really is a crisis now. And then I want to talk about sustainable coexistence with wildfire, how Hobart is really an ideal model system. And what is going to keep me going is trying to stem, obviously, another fire disaster, which I'll talk about, but also the fact that we could quite possibly have very, very serious consequences for the insurance and real estate in Hobart. And this is, I'll explain, I've now become very entangled with insurers. And then I want to go through some of the tools we've got, some of the really practical stuff. I'm doing a lot of really, really practical stuff, but running into lots of barriers that are stopping the speed of the adaptation we need. So keeps me at it. And then I'm going to talk about this sort of model that I've now got to explain what we've got to do to get through the bottleneck we're in. If we don't get through the bottleneck, we will get through the bottleneck. There's absolutely no question about that. It's just how pain-free getting through the bottleneck is going to be. So that's a summary. So hopefully it'll be optimistic, but certainly I'm starting off with something which is extraordinarily pessimistic. So with this, one of the reasons pyrogeography, as I'll explain, its remit geographically can be global or local. And I'm very interested in adaptation, which is generally local and regional. But if you're going to tell people that they're in serious, serious trouble, like really serious trouble, it's got to be good. Your argument's got to be good. And so one way of having a good argument is to do global research and publish globally in the best journals, because then you're getting scrutinised, but you're also convincing yourself it's not just some local problem you've got. This is really a global problem. So one of the things that we've noticed, and back in 2017, a bit of another origin story, I had the idea, the insight that it would be possible to use remote sensing to identify the most extreme fires on Earth. And, you know, we did that. We wrote a paper using these clustered hotspots from one of the satellites, NASA satellite, and we were able to take out, you know, volcanoes and industrial fires and so on. So these are very, very intense fires. And we looked at that, but we weren't able to actually see a trend. And when I got my Laureate fellowship, this was always in the back of my mind. I've got to go back to this question of seeing a trend. And what's interesting is that it was kind of lucky that we didn't talk about the temporal dimension, because that trend was actually only beginning to emerge around the time when we were doing our first paper. So I won't dwell on the details, but there's lots of ways you can use this remote sensing data, various indices, some of the fire radiative power, whether you do it by day or by night. But what we're able to see is this very, very sharp uptick in extreme fires, and it fits with a lot of other extreme fire behaviour. This paper has been cited something like 250 times, and it's only a couple of years old. So it's a very influential piece of work. So the second thing we did, which has just been published in Science, and there's the origin story, is one of the co-authors is an insurance analyst with the largest reinsurer in the world, Munich Re. And so when we published our work in 2017, he contacted me, and I was beginning to realise one of the things you can get very sad as a scientist is, you know, who's reading your work, what influence you're having. When you get into this applied work, you're not realising that people who are taking billion-dollar bets are actually reading your work. They just don't cite it. They're too busy placing really serious money. So Marcus wrote to me, and you know, I knew nothing about insurance and reinsurance. So I said to Marcus, yeah, just trying to wrap my head around it when I was introducing the postdoc Callum Cunningham, who published, the lead author of this work, which has just come out in Science. And I said to him, if Munich Re was a football team, like, where is it? And he goes, well, it's at the top. You know, it's the best, it's the biggest. So we're dealing, you know, wow. So I negotiated with that 2017 paper to get Munich Re's data. And a little thing, it took a long time to get the money to analyse the data. And by the time I'd got my fellowship, they said, yes, we will honour the agreement, but we're not giving you the last 2 years because it's now too valuable, because the wildfire desk in that company has changed. You know, the awareness, the whole atmospherics around wildfire. Anyway, to cut a long story short, basically we can see a very, very consistent trend in the most damaging wildfires relative to national GDP, wildfire major fatality events, billion-dollar events. So we're looking total damage costs. We're looking at this incredibly significant uptick in major fire disasters. That's why I say, you know, if you want to argue, we can say there isn't a global fire crisis. So actually, you know, read our paper, you're wrong, there is. And the insurers are on our side because they're actually one of the co-authors. So I'm sorry, there really is a global fire crisis, and you're going to know all about it because the reinsurers are going to be passing their bets onto you, right? Because the reinsurers are the people who cover the insurers. So we're having a lot, suddenly my life has changed. I'm having a lot more to do with insurers and reinsurers, and like, I don't know, the capitalist version of the CIA or something, you know, it's this other whole really serious world that I didn't have it, you know, who would have thought a bloke who was interested in the bush was getting into this. So the next thing we did was we just wanted to know at very short range global warming, which is basically, you know, 1.5 degrees, which is basically now where these extreme fire events were going to get worse, and the answer is entirely what you would expect. All of the places that are known to have a wildfire problem, Mediterranean, Europe, Western US, Southeastern Australia, a little bit of Africa, a little bit of South America, but basically the big three are Western US, Mediterranean, Europe, and Southeastern Australia. This is like, it's going to get worse than what it already is. So we know there's a global fire crisis. The other problem is that there is evidence, and I wrote a commentary. There's a sequence of papers actually which have been looking at the behaviour of the forests as they're switching, and you might have heard about this, they're switching from sinks of carbon to sources of carbon relating to fire. And so in this diagram, the idea is that you can put that biospheric carbon, you can put more biospheric carbon into the atmosphere. And so it's worth considering that in the boreal forest, in the organic soils of the boreal forest, which are combustible and are being combusted, there's 2 atmospheres worth of greenhouse gases in the boreal forest. So if we start messing around with the boreal forest, we could really increase the amount of greenhouse gases and possibly derange the oscillations associated with the Ice Age to cross some planetary threshold, which would be very bad. So obviously the point here is decarbonisation is going to be necessary, but stewardship of forests to resist the effect of climate change is going to be incredibly important. So just sort of like buying an EV or something isn't going to solve it. We've also got to do a lot of work in our forest estate to stop emissions. And the calculations, I mean, they're absolutely amazing. The Canadian fires a couple of years ago, if the Canadian fires were a country, they were up there with the biggest 3 polluters in the world. You know, there was 1 million hectares of forest burn. You know, there's just astronomical quantities of greenhouse gases. It's very interesting. These papers are, you know, in really top tier journals, and there's the Chinese are very aware of this. So the Chinese were, in fact, one of the first groups to be aware of forests seeming to be becoming unstable carbon sinks. So it's something to think about. So what, it's really disconcerting having a different font, but anyway, that's okay. But I'll just convince myself it's hipster, so that's good. So really, to sort of the point of entry of what I want to talk about is that you can think about it as an alternative stable state problem. And if you have a highly adapted society, and they have existed because indigenous societies have coexisted with flammable landscapes for millennia, and you have some climate change, the basin doesn't change that much. A very resilient system. But if you disrupt that, and we did, particularly in Australia, but Tasmania, we disrupt it. I'll come to some of these problems. It's not just climate change, it's also these disruptions. We've got these legacies, landscape legacies. You can get into a really dysfunctional state, which we're in. And that dysfunctional state, the absolute classic example of the dysfunctional state is what typically happens after a fire disaster. So the Royal Commission, after the 2019-20 fires, there was a Royal Commission. And there's actually, I can't remember the number, it depends which way you slice it or dice it, but since the mid-19th century, and certainly the 20th century, there's been something like 60 inquiries into bushfires. So it's like, you know, wow, there's a fire, wow, you know, and they make very incremental. So we are getting better, but they're very incremental changes in the way we're working with fire. We're in a dysfunctional state. And then the climate change basin is getting deeper. So it's getting harder and harder to climb out of that that red ball and cross over, and that's all come at the very end. It's really difficult because it's coordinated. It's not just an ecological problem, it's a legal, social, political problem, individual actions to get into a sustainable state. But the point is, it is, I believe, entirely possible to have sustainable coexistence with wildfire. So I'm going to start talking about some of the things that, what this looks like, how this is going to work. So that's that's like a conceptual model that I've written, and I find that really interesting and helpful for me. It might be confusing for you that, we're basically in a bad place, but it's possible to get to a good place. But the longer we leave it, the harder it's going to get from a bad place to a good place. And if you're in a good place, you're going to be really quite adaptive, and you have this extra resilience. So that's really what we need. And, respectfully, we're just so far off where we need to be. So a couple of years ago, again, this font was just blown up, the thing. But a couple of years ago, I was asked to write an opinion piece for Science about, this question. And I really wanted to tie in Jason Sharples, a fire scientist. Actually, he's of Indigenous descent. He's a firefighter. He's a really interesting guy. Thinks very deeply about fire. And so we wrote this thing, and I really wanted to have a picture of what a sustainable landscape's going to look like. So to really try to get people to the idea that there's going to be these activities which are going to be different. We're going to be doing things, whether it's herbivory, mechanical clearing, garden design, prescribed burning, cultural burning. There's all sorts of stuff we can do to get into a more sustainable state. So the rest of the talk, I'm actually going to be drilling into some of this and talking about how the research I'm doing is actually trying to realise that vision. But to have a vision, you need a discipline. And what ended up happening is I was doing a huge amount of travelling earlier, and I learnt the word pyrogeography, and I thought, geez, I could use that, because I started thinking globally, and I wrote, first paper, there was a paper we wrote with a whole bunch of really eminent fire scientists. We published in Science, Fire in the Earth System. It's been cited about 3,500 times. It's like a landmark paper. But really that was the root of the idea of pyrogeography. And so now, not only am I saying I'm a pyrogeographer, lots of people are there saying they're pyrogeographers, and then I was very happy to establish a new journal called the Journal of Pyrogeography. So there is a thing, I'm a pyrogeographer, there you want to do pyrogeography, you can publish in this journal, which has just been established. And the nice thing about pyrogeography is it's holistic, it's multidisciplinary. So when you're thinking about these questions, what's interesting with the Royal Commissions or the government inquiries, the lawyers, who were very clever people, they invent pyrogeography every inquiry because they want to understand the whole thing holistically. So they want this, what meteorology, ecology, law, and so like they don't know, they're sort of inventing pyrogeography. But what that means is you're thinking about, why did this fire disaster happen? What's the social, the ecological, the cultural context? And the really nice thing is to be able to then say we can do this at scale from global to local patch, even if you want. And you can think about whatever field you like. So if I want to work with a lawyer, I do. I have. If I want to work with an epidemiologist, of course I do. Want to work with a plant physiologist? Yeah, why not? A linguist, an anthropologist. I've done all that. Worked with Aboriginal people. I've done, it's because I'm unbounded because I'm a pyrogeographer. So it's not like, what's this guy? Why doesn't he just stick to his discipline? I am. But one of the things of sticking to your discipline is you find the people who can really help you, because it's a very collaborative, and it's really important to have this human dimension, because a lot of these problems are actually cultural. and, cross-cultural. So I've been, very privileged to have worked with Aboriginal people for 30 years in Arnhem Land. Next year I'm going to write a paper with I can't wait to write it with my Aboriginal collaborator, and he did a bark painting for me, and then it's all recorded in language, the story of what he wanted to say about fire. It's going to be really, have a linguist translate what he wrote, to explain his things. So you have that discipline. Then what I established was a fire centre, and the fire centre has got a number of things. It does sort of these global scale things. It's trying to do this transdisciplinary research. We're doing an experiment on the University Reserve. We've got community outreach. We built an app or two, and we built Fire Lab, where we're doing interesting things with the Fire Lab, bioenergy and exposure. Collaborating with my partner Faye Johnson as epidemiologist, we're actually moving our attention to firefighter health, because if you read the New York Times, they're really freaking out about what is happening to firefighters because of these extra long fire seasons, so much smoke and so on. So we've got an exposure facility where we'll be doing, or she will be doing, experiments with humans, which is pretty out there, and it's quite a unique facility in the world. So it's something really. The fire centre has got an experiment and an actual laboratory and a footprint socially, and we've got lots of interesting things. And then my Laureate program is got this global analysis, and then we're thinking about house loss, which I'll talk about, doing a lot of comparative house loss. We're thinking about Hobart, which I'll talk about, flammability and fuel management, which I'll talk about, Aboriginal fire management, which I'm not going to talk about, but it's a really big chunk of the work I'm doing, and that's a whole separate box of tricks, and obviously very complicated because it's collaborative and co-designed, and then a whole bunch of social science work which we're doing. So, but all of that fun research is actually trying to create the opportunity to build tools, techniques and training. It's kind of interesting, the university environment has become so transactional. It's not just like, I'll knock up a course, because it's like, oh, well, then how are you going to pay for that? Who are you going to charge? We do have some online courses. Next week I'm actually talking to the Australian Institute of Disaster Risk Study. Institute of Disaster Risk Reduction Institute or something, I can't remember. But anyway, I'm looking at ways where we can get into the wild some of the various pieces of knowledge we've got. So let's think about Hobart and just, so 1967, a fire nearly took out the city. Absolutely amazing event. Started, or one of the fires, there were many, about noon, and then 3 hours later it was down at Taroona. And I've been doing some work on the Domain, another project, and I've been looking at the aerial photography. In 1967, after 11 days, I'm going to show you 11 days after the fire event, they flew some photography. And there's this stunning great fire scar on the Domain, which I'm 100% certain is an ember. So we're actually really fascinated by this. This is quite a big fire event, very poorly understood. The insurers they really want to know what we're discovering. But I'll just frighten you a little bit now. So that's 11 days after 67. That's the brewery, and you can sort of orientate yourself. And there's Poets Road, up Lofty, and you can see how open it is. It's just a very, very open landscape. So what we're, in the analysis we're doing, we're making vegetation maps, and on a 67, we call that open vegetation. I mean, obviously I don't have a time machine, but it's what we would call oldfield. It's sort of rough, sort of abandoned land or rough land, or, might be grazing land, rough pasture, some of it might be farm, but it's probably weed infested. I know the people who tamed Knocklofty, there was a lot of gorse up there, but very open. And we can zoom in a bit more, you know, so you really can look at it. You can see how open it is, and you can start to see some of the rows of the houses that got burnt down. And we're studying those houses to find out what is it about those houses, you know, their proximity to bushland and so on, relative to a sample that didn't. But that's 1967, but that's now. And it's really blows your mind when you, because when I first saw that, I go, huh? That doesn't look right. That's like, sure, the city's got bigger and everything. There's so much more bush. It's just exploded. The bush has just exploded. And we're seeing this all around, seeing it on the domain. So why we're really stressed about the fire risk is that in 67, you know, that was a very extreme weather event. You know, it was really out there. I mean, Dunalley eclipsed it. But it was a really unusual event, and there was a lot of fire in the landscape, and there wasn't such good firefighting capacity, and people were probably very lackadaisical about fire, but it was much more open. You know, but now you look at this and you go, well, we're getting more hotter weather, heavier fuels, and an expanded city into this bushland. You're going, you kidding me? Like. And that's what the insurers are saying. They're just like, I had a really interesting conversation with one of the reinsurers, rang me up and said, look, we've like, let's talk about Hobart. And then at the end of it, he said, oh, I thought you were going to convince me that, you know, we were being alarmist. Because the models they're seeing, they just don't know how they can bet on this. It doesn't look right. So what are you going to do about it? So I'm not in the, now I'm sort of moving into the problem-solving phase. So in North America, there's been a lot of interest in thinning of regrowth. So they have a similar thing where they've had a lot of forests have thickened up enormously. Complex set of reasons. Some of it's related to the cessation of Aboriginal fire management. And what they've found is that you get way better outcomes with thinning and prescribed burning, and it's much better for carbon storage. So that starts raising some questions about how we could potentially be thinking about our regrowth forests from areas that have been burnt very intensely by bushfires, but also regrowth forests from the intentional conversion of mature forests to regrowth by foresters. That was an absolute intentionality. Absolutely intentional. In fact, I was looking back at a paper I wrote in 1982 reporting that, you know, they were virtually, it was either 10% or 0 of the rainforest species were being taken off forests that were being cleared in the early 1980s. Those rainforest timbers, celery top sassafras myrtle was being burnt. You know, and now we're the specialty timber market, you know, yeah, you know, it's just, we intentionally converted our forests into regrowth. So we've been doing some work around Hobart, thinking about this sort of more active management. We did a project with the City of Hobart. We're looking at mechanical treatments, prescribed burning, trying to get this, kick the system that's overgrown into a state where you can thin the understory and make it much more amenable to burning. So we're just dipping our finger into this. We're doing an experiment at the University Reserve. Would really like to do this into the wet forests on the lower slopes of the mountain, because that's where the real action is. If that thing catches on fire, it's going to be incredible. And this sort of actually harmonises with some of the thinking that's coming actually from Indigenous groups in Victoria, where there's a lot of regrowth from the gold mining periods. So these forests are very densely stocked, and they're saying, well, you know, maybe you could thin them and you can take a byproduct, a firewood byproduct. You might, if you've got very good eyes, you can see that. somewhere, which I won't waste time. And then you can actually, I suppose the word would be restore, and some of this restoration ecology has been occurring on the domain, which is, again, I was looking at the aerial photos of domains today. Amazing thickening event which started around 1980s, but it's just wall-to-wall casuarina up there. The council is actually doing some thinning, all just very, very early days, but at least it's proof of concept. So one of the things that I envision is could we, and again the social license, the distrust, all the weirdness about forestry, but it is actually in principle we could be taking a lot more of the debris out of forests. They're thinning the regrowth forests, trying to get them back into a multi-age state. They are doing some thinning. I've studied it on the East Coast. Not talking about it now. Published a paper this year with the forest company Midway, but they're leaving behind a colossal amount of material because it's not economic, and it's also constrained by the way forest extraction is administered. But there's potentially, you could have like bioenergy plants, and they use this in Scandinavia. We'd be taking this material, say to Lake Leak or to Campbelltown or somewhere, and you could just be like, I don't know, it's a trade-off, but it's sitting there in the forest, and if it burns, it's going to burn real hot. Maybe it would be smart to burn it and get some electricity from it, and then you get maybe locally here, if we do work on Mount Wellington, we could have like subsidised firewood, subsidised heating, subsidised electricity, and getting the dividend of saying, but you are going to be able to insure your houses, because if you don't do this, the reinsurers are going to be putting us on notice, basically, that it's uninsurable. So at the other scale, we've been thinking about garden design, and so we've been studying gardens. We've got a whole sequence of papers around gardens in Hobart and defensible space, and basically houses are vulnerable in gardens if they get radiant heat or flame contact onto them. So, and if you have a garden that's well maintained, it can also not be fuel for an ember. So you get a firebrand coming in if it's, my garden has got a lot of rock, a lot of gravel, metal fence, like really wanting to, there's some great photos you see of the Lahina. There's this fantastic house that was renovated that survived. Everything else around it was burnt to the ground, but they actually had a really, good garden and well-designed, property that it can survive. So we're putting a lot of effort into these garden designs, and I won't dwell too much on. We made an app. We're trying to get that material, that app, built into an app that's being supported by insurers who self-assessment, and then you can get a benefit if you get a clean bill of health for your house and your garden. So we're right on the cusp. If we can get that delivered into the wild, that will be an example of one of the tools, techniques and training that we've actually delivered something in the real world. So one of the things that is related to this, you all know when you prioritise and triage life and property. And I'm sitting in a conference. I go to a lot of disaster conferences. It just does really strange things too. But it's interesting because these are the frontline people. And I'm listening to this guy talking about BAL, bushfire attack level. Now, bushfire attack level is, if you know anything, if you've tried to build a house or renovate a house, BAL is a huge implication for the cost of your build. So Australians have gone really into, there's a whole cottage industry in BAL assessment, BAL engineering. So if you live in the flame zone, which is where you're going to be sort of like fern tree or something like that, you build a new house, you have a BAL 40 house, which is, to withstand, your house will probably cost twice as what it would cost if it was not in the flame zone, if it was just down in suburbia. Because I'm listening to a building engineer saying, yeah, you know, the thing about that is I've got to look my clients in the eye at the end of this and tell them, but if there's a fire, you can't stay in that house. And I go, I'm sitting there going, huh? So I put my hand up and I go, well, what's actually your priority here? Is it life or property? And then it was like, yeah, the guy from Cyro who was there, and and I said, respectfully, it sounds like a fudge. He said, I need to talk to you outside. I thought, gee, you're going to get bolted. And what it was, he said, look, it's crazy. You know, he said to me afterwards, we're in this crazy situation. We've got this huge impost on building, but we're not actually able to ride it out in our buildings. So then I started thinking about it. It's just so great. Like, why going to a practitioner conference, which in some ways is like a long dental appointment, because it's not, you know, it's not like science. But in another way, it was just like absolutely full Monty philosophy, because it was like, it was all just ripped back to, well, what are we actually trying to do here? So then with my postdoc, I started thinking about it, obsessing about it. And we did this analysis, and it's actually going to be published. We did this analysis where we looked at annual fatalities in America and annual fatalities in Australia. And for every fatality, how many houses do you lose? And it turns out in America, you lose way more houses than Australia. So in Australia, we've got a lower ratio of house loss to fatality than in America. That is interesting, because the priority is, say, life and property. But it seems to be that in America and Australia, we're thinking about life and property differently. So I dived into this, and it was actually fun. I started with the philosophy of disasters, which there really isn't one. Then the philosophy of wildfires, which is just beginning. There's one paper. But you drill into this, and I realized that virtually there's only one paper that somebody had ever asked and plotted that for 1 year, for 1 year, but the years were different. A different American year and different Australian year. We don't know what it means, but it's different. And it's like, well, the statistics were just extraordinarily different, and it is for the same 20 years. And we thought of secular trends and everything. It's very thoroughly analysed now, and we'll tell you they're different. And what that led us to realising that there's actually a completely different paradigm about the life property situation in America. It's just so interesting, because in America, it's all about evacuations. It's about human life. So the LA fires, which they burnt down, you know, I don't know how many thousand, 14,000 houses, whatever, remarkably few people died. Remarkably few. Whereas in Australia, the 09 fires, 173 people died. If you've got iView, ABC, I was there, you could see the story. It's one of the most harrowing ABC documentaries you're ever going to see. It's like these people are completely trashed from that experience. And I'm there as an ecologist looking at King Lake, like on the side of the road, and I'm going, that is burnt-roof. Right. And these people are not repaired. And that was 09. They're not repaired. They had near-death experiences. They had people when you died. It's just horrifically ugly. Now, the point is, in Australia, we went building codes. Now, what's interesting, so evacuation, and we're sort of catching the American disease. We want to evacuate. The current doctrine is leave early. But under the shared responsibility doctrine, which I'll come to, nobody knows what early is. Nobody knows. They're not saying leave early is like you have to leave now, and they're not saying where to go. They're just saying, you got to leave early. You got to activate your plan. What's your plan? I don't know what your plan is. I told you to have a plan. Like in America, which is weird for the land for free, this is a mandated evacuation. We're going to get you out of here. But we know in doing that, your houses are going to burn down, because the doctrine in Australia was people save houses, houses save people. And that was a very strong doctrine until it failed with the 09 fires, when people died in place. So we are now switching to this leave early. But what's interesting is neither of those things are thinking about fire shelters. And the fire shelter situation is just absolutely fascinating. I wrote a paper with a lawyer, Philip and McCormack, about fire shelters because these folk down in the Channel were taken to court. They were charged and fined more than common assault. They had all manner of terrible things happen to them, and $60,000 later they are able to keep their fire shelter. But Kingborough Council was very close to demolishing it or dynamiting it or doing something bad to it. I don't know what they were planning to do with it. But it's kind of weird because actually if you go back to that diagram, the solution, in my opinion, and I've asked politicians to tell me because nobody will tell me what is the barrier in Tasmania about fire shelters. What's the problem? If I can buy an engineer designed, a government-approved fire shelter in Victoria and install it according to those things and have a fire engineer say it's okay, why would that, what's so controversial about that? Is it because the bureaucracy just doesn't want extra work, or is it they don't want to be liable if you get baked in there, but if they say you're going to leave early and you die on the road, well, that's your problem because you didn't activate your plan early enough? I don't know. And there's a lot of armchair sort of lawyerness about it. So that's a really fun paper. I learned a lot out of that. I was thinking, a really concrete example of adaptation is actually not even the engineering solution. I've read not the Australian standard, the Australian guidelines. Very, very good. They've thought of everything. They've thought of pets. They've thought of air. They've thought of periscopes. They've thought of, they're engineers. They're smart people. They've done a great job. You can get the thing. There's a commercial people who make this stuff. So it's not we don't know what to do. There's no administrative structure for doing this because we're just, I don't know because we think, I don't know, someone's got to tell me. If you interact with a politician, ask them, what is actually the problem here? Like, what's the and the funny thing was that the neighbour, Tasmanian thing, I know the neighbour, these people, he's a magistrate, he said, that is not a fire shelter, that's a wine cellar. And if it was a wine cellar, it wouldn't have been a problem. So then we come to the shared responsibility elements, which is, I've been talking about some of the evacuation, defendable space, what you do with your garden, fuel treatments, thinning, burning, planning regulations and fire shelters. So these are all of the things which you very quickly go, and why being a pyrogeographer is so nice is that you don't sort of go, oh, stop it, well, I'm a scientist, I can't think about these things. You go, no, I'm a pyrogeographer, I keep thinking about them. I just keep going. And it turns out that there was a really nice piece of work by Blythe McLennan and John Hamner, who really were thinking about this doctrine, which is the current doctrine of shared responsibility. And basically they said, there's a continuum, it's a work in progress, there's the self-reliance model, and there's the central authority model. And so it's a glass half full, half empty situation. And I think shared responsibility is really important for everybody who's interested in this, because you can go to agencies, you can go to politicians, you are not sticking your beak into something that's not your business. It is absolutely your business. You are told to share the responsibility. The agencies and the government's doctrine is saying, we will not guarantee anything in an emergency. Nothing. No emergency warnings, no nothing. Don't think someone's coming to help you. That's actually what the fine print says. Nothing. You have to take responsibility. Now, they haven't entirely said it the way I just said it, but actually that's the truth. So but the reason it's a half full opportunity is to say, hey, I want to take responsibility. I want my community to thin this crazy stuff up here. I want to do these things. I want a fire shelter. I want to have my community have evacuation plan. I want all these things. I want to have a telephone, an app thing so I can talk to all of my neighbours. Why not? They're going to stand in your way because they're standing in your way. So, oh, I forgot. You're taking full responsibility now. let's not share anymore. Now, there is a saying, shared responsibility is responsibility not taken. So we need to start understanding about what do we mean by shared responsibility and whose responsibility. So we've been doing a bunch of these funky fonts. We've been doing a bunch of social science, and funnily enough, in my Laureate, the social science stuff has actually preceded a lot of the other stuff. But, you know, breaking news, and it's actually in the iView thing about I was there. Men and women have different risk appetites, but not all men and women. So it's really, it's sort of a really a result. It's like statistically they're different, but actually there's a lot of overlap. But one of the things when you ask people about their intentions, gender is an incredibly important determinant. And so that means you have to be very conscious of what sort of messages you're communicating. Well, we broke this down in another, we've had a number of social science surveys. We broke this down a little bit more proportionately. We wanted to know whether there's been a change. So we asked the question again, and we were able to show that right across the board, men and women are wanting to leave early, but there is a difference between rural folk and city folk. And we've drilled into this a lot more, and there's a lot of people, particularly younger people, who are and people not, you know, who are only recently arrived in Australia, have no idea of any of this stuff. It's just like nobody told me that I might be like told on the radio or in social media that the city is under threat and I have 12 hours to do something. You know, like, and it could actually be down on a really dangerous day. It could be down to, it could be less than an hour if there was a, you know, because where's the ignition? Just anyway, don't want to frighten you too much. So we're really interested in understanding that, because that means what is our market? It's almost like marketing, and we actually used archetypes, which, you know, the Jungian archetype approach, which is used by marketing, you know, to start understanding these behaviours, intentions, and knowledge, all these things. It just opens up this Pandora's box of fascinating stuff. So it's so much fun. But another thing we did, there was another panel study, and I wanted to know, you know, people's attitudes towards field treatments. And a really, really bizarre thing that came out of this is that the only factor, post hoc, we had this political spectrum, which is agency and empowerment, you know, self-determination, command and control, nature and culture, you know, artificial or natural. And we sort of ordinated a spectrum of different treatments, which is, you know, right up to command and control, just like flatten the whole thing, you know, let's turn it into gravel. And then right down here is, you know, oh, we'll just have Aboriginal people managing it. And what was interesting is that spectrum sort of fell out along political affiliation. We weren't looking for this, but it actually, politics became quite important. And what's fascinating in the Liberals, you know, it's sort of like saying, oh, we've discovered the teals, because they're actually broader spectrum. And there's a couple of things which I think are really important to note here, is that there's an amazing amount of, you know, concern, I suppose, and attitudes about about fuel management and the risk of fuel. And there are underlying correlates politically, but we haven't yet politicised this. But respectfully, there are some people who are really trying to do that. And by God, there's going to be trouble if they succeed, because it's going to make all of the stuff I've just been talking about is going to be immediately front-loaded into a political context. Whereas at the moment, this is just like a problem we're trying to solve. So we've got to be, I think, really got to handle this stuff with care and try not, because it's the superstructure is there to be politicised if we want it to, you know, to have, like, you know, the Greens versus, you know, the other mob. But there's also some magical thinking here, because some of the things that people really love don't exist. Like, there's actually no large-scale Aboriginal field management. That's aspiration. It doesn't exist, and even if it could exist, the scale of it is not going to be sufficient for the work that we have ahead of us. So we also looked at people's attitudes about their gardens, and it's been really interesting. We've looked at high-risk gardens, low-risk gardens. A lot of people have some awareness, but there's a lot of anxiety. So they're just not really certain of what to do. And this comes back to the work we're doing. We're trying to communicate better design and have some appreciation of people are going to be very emotional about things. We're coming up with some techniques, with remote sensing techniques, which we might be able to, at scale, do a very rapid scan of gardens and then zoom into gardens which we think are very dangerous, which we go and get assessments. And if it's done well, you can take people on a journey to get their gardens into a better place to protect their house rather than penalise people. So it's, again, it's a lot of the social science is kind of annoying, but it's actually really important. One of the things that you might have noticed with the discussion about gardens that I haven't talked about is biodiversity, and we've really got to be focused on that as well. That's another topic so there's all of this work that, my Laureate program is certainly making progress, but this is an absolutely enormously complex problem. So at the end of this, the shared responsibility triangle sort of I made up. You've got managers, researchers, community individuals, you've got governance all around it. How are we sharing the responsibility? Who's responsible? Am I responsible? People ring me up and say, tell me what to do. They're going to have a researcher, like I've now got a donations page on my website, actually, for the last thing. And I'm serious, people wanting me to talk all the time. So one of the other things that we're realising is that this is going to require an enormous amount of investment. There's a very nice paper in Science just recently where it was from a Canadian perspective, but it's this sort of classic thing, economic problem, that if you want to actually get the real advantage, you've got this big upfront cost. So it's a very common problem in economics, an upfront cost to get the benefit. But if you don't do anything, or you just do incrementalism, which is what the inquiries generally lead to, is that your problems and the costs of the problems just continue to rise and skyrocket. The cost of fuel management in firefighting in Tasmania are just, they don't say the numbers, but the numbers are actually incredible, like the last summer, because they're aviation, so much aviation involved, so, tens of millions of dollars. Now, the reason a broke place like Tasmania can do that is because they can enact there's a federal arrangements for emergency and disasters. So they, at a certain threshold point, then the money can flow from the Commonwealth. But it's not a sustainable thing. Eventually we're going to just run into it, and you run out of helicopters anyway. So getting an investment in these fuel treatments, certainly making a place like Hobart safer, this is, I think, really critical to do that. So just to end, which I mentioned the wildfire adaptation triad, triangle or triad, what we're really now doing is to make this work is that we've got to do the three things we're already doing, but they've got to be done in a coordinated way. We've got to do research and development, which I am doing. Got to do education and demonstration. I'm trying to do, surprisingly difficult. And then we need incentives and enforcement. So we need to actually behavioural economics. We need to not just penalise people, we also need to encourage people, reward people, whether that's just a feel good as much as, getting a reduction on your insurance premium, which is, some of this app that the Building Resilience Council has with some insurers, that's, you can show that you've done an assessment of your property, and hopefully our garden app component will be in that, you get a discount on your premium. So those sorts of things can be done. And I think this is really the key. For me, this is a sort of like, this is an organising principle for what I'm doing, what I'm trying to do, is have this close engagement with people who are going to be able to provide incentives and enforcement. So that's my talk. I hope I haven't depressed you too much.
Thank you so much, Dave. Professor Bowman has kindly agreed to answer some questions for us. So if you have them, just wait till I'm with you so that everyone can hear the question.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. It was fantastic. I've dealt in, I guess, risk management for many years. And today I went and had a look at the risk maps around Hobart for bushfire. And there's like a big red zone. And then there's a, I think they call it fire impact, which is sort of like a 100 or 200 metre buffer. Could you just comment on that in terms of ground truthing on GIS, so that to what extent is it a reasonable and accurate reflection of the real risk?
Yeah, no, great question. In fact, I'm giving a talk next week at another practitioner conference on this exact topic of using GIS analyses for risk. Basically, there's a handful of approaches, and the best approach is to look at house loss, a geographical analysis of house loss. And there's been surprisingly few. So the 67 analysis will be, there'll be in Australia, there would be probably less than 3 or 4, and the insurers cling on to this. So that's why they're so fascinated by a 67 one. With the 2019-25s, my colleague at Wollongong, Owen Price, who's a world leader in house loss modelling, we've done that, and we can show really nicely under different fire weather conditions that bushfire-prone land buffer of 100 metres, which practitioners dreamed up, is actually very good. It's a very, very practical thing until you get catastrophic. When you get catastrophic, the curve just flattens and you're getting embers and house loss, deep penetration. Now, what the insurers are really scared of is not just the deep penetration, it's then the conflagration. And apparently the new risk models, Moody's, which we can't see because they're commercial, Owen was telling me they have the Inferno switch in them where you get an urban conflagration. And that's what they don't like seeing, because that's LA, that's Lahaina, that's what we don't want to have happen in Hobart. So what I've just done an analysis where we've used GIS approaches to calculate, based actually on BAL, the radiation load, and we've used a supercomputer to look at trajectories of embers and ember load. We've put that into a GIS analysis to ask the question, if we would do targeted field treatments around Hobart on the interface, what proportion, under a certain fire weather conditions, what proportion of houses could we reduce their exposure? Now, we're not saying the likelihood of destruction, just their exposure. And there's actually really dramatic benefit. So theoretically, and this is where it starts getting real and scary, we calculated that 1,000 hectares of bush would have to be sacrificed in the Glenorchy and Hobart area, but that's on a strip of 100 metres wide. So, well, and then the question is, what sort of sacrifice? Do we need to take out every tree? Do we just take out the understory, and then what do we do behind it? So rather than that sort of blunt instrument prescribed burning you're seeing on the eastern shore, according to our modelling, you could actually target like really intensive. But hey, guess what? Everyone's going to see this. Everyone's going to see it. You're going to look at Mount Nelson. There's going to be this thumping great wide, and I often think to myself, I'll be driving to the airport saying, I did that. I did that. I made that happen. And then maybe people will like me for making it happen. Maybe they'll hate me. I don't know. But that's that's why the social science is going to be, because, and that's, why we're wanting interpretive trails and telling the story and doing, talks like this, is because what's actually coming your way is if we're going to have a chance of having house insurance, we're going to have to do some, we're going to actually have to physically do something, and that's going to be highly visible. But then we put up with easements under power lines, so maybe it's not that bad. And maybe they can be beautiful, that biodiverse. That's what I'm trying to create.
David, yes, fantastic presentation. I'll try and turn this into a question, not a comment. I think you'll be aware recently that the Kingborough Council has just recently switched 1,470 properties from environmental living to landscape conservation zone. I'm really intrigued to get your thoughts on how doing something and bringing it back to something that a ratepayer can control will come directly in conflict with rules that have been set by the council, and that to go around those rules, we're not certain what you have to do. We're not certain how much it will cost. Your house burns down, can you rebuild? All of these things are creating real dramas in the community. And I'd just be interested if you had some quick thoughts on that.
So I don't know the details, but my understanding is it could become, with this new zoning, it could become difficult to do thinning.
Yeah.
Right. And so isn't it interesting, you know, the road to health's paved with good intentions. I mean, that's actually, they're wanting people to have biodiversity, and there are, you know, white gums, which are important for, you know, for spotted pardlopes and things like that. So there's that, you can understand that, and it's sort of like you have the same impulse, which is, oh, well, let's just have native plants in our gardens, which is like, yeah, but they're highly flammable, but maybe you keep them wet. So there's all of these things that are going on. One of the projects that I'm getting a PhD student to do is to do the land cover of the 19th century Hobart. And if you do that, and you can start showing people how open the place was under Palawa management and colonial management, because they were burning a lot of firewood. That's probably why Hobart didn't burn down, because they were running out of firewood. They had to go to the Eastern Shore to get firewood. So then that could be really helpful to say, look, you know, it's all about a balance. Now, the question is, can councils deal with balance and judgment calls, or do they just need, like, oh, this is our new edict, you know, you saw down a tree, you're a bad person.
Yeah.
Or they've got all sorts of weird things, you know, that I know because I interact with them, you know, that if a tree's got this, you know, footprint of roots, and if you dig a trench there, you're going to hurt this tree. And I know somebody who assesses this, they go, how do they know that? Scientifically, how do they know that? Nobody knows how they know that. So there's a whole lot of, this is, you know, adaptation work to do. How do you know what is true, and can you adapt? And maybe that's a great idea. Maybe what they're saying is a great idea for biodiversity, but it's a horrible idea for fire risk. So can you have planning rules that are intelligent enough and not be gamed? And I don't, you know, this is why ultimately it's going to become a cultural and a social question. But if you're locking people in to no thinning, then I would be on the go to the Kingborough Council. So why are you penalising people who want shelters? Because if that's what you're doing, you are committing them 100% certain that they're going to see their houses burned down. They may die because they won't be able to get out because there'll be tree falls and things. You know, so then you know, that's another form of adaptation.
It is. Yeah.
It's complicated.
It is complicated.
Professor Bowman, I'm a very simple person. I think if you've got fuel, you've got fire. And if you've got a lot of fuel, you've got an intense fire. And if you've got an intense fire, that's the end of biodiversity, or that's a terrible threat to biodiversity. And I live in Kingborough municipality for my sins. So I'm just worried about, or concerned about, why we have problems with that basic principle of fuel equals fire equals intensity?
Well, I can tell you why. What I want to do, I haven't made the slide, but I want to have a slide with 3 jerry cans, and a jerry can of water, and a jerry can of diesel, and a jerry can of petrol, and then say on a really hot day, what jerry can frightens you the most, right? And they'd say, well, petrol. And on a cold day, what frightens you about the petrol, right? But the problem with the bush, it goes from a jerry can of water, winter, it's wet, nothing will burn, to a jerry can of petrol. That's the problem of that transition, that you're taking, fuel becomes more and more available as it dries out. And when it's wet, it's actually, there's no fuel. So, you can run around Mount Wellington throwing matches everywhere in the middle of winter. Well, maybe cold day. But if you do that on a hot summer's day, you're going to kill everybody. So that's part of the problem of, you're absolutely right. It's about the energy in the landscape, but it's a way that energy is packaged. And what I think we can do is, with the thinning, we can say we want trees. Trees actually, apart from the fact they're important for biodiversity, they're really good blotters for, and they put wind drag, and they're blotters for the firebrands, so they can just take, resist the wind and just intercept a huge amount of the firebrands. So there's, and radiation shields. But you've got to make certain that you're not allowing the fuel on the forest floor coupled to the crowns. So there's all of this question of the 3-dimensional arrangement of the fuel as well, and the moisture content of the fuel. And one of the problems we're seeing in these overstocked forests, particularly on the East Coast, is that it's very great regret that one of the other things the foresters did was convert multi-age forests to even-age forests. These even-age forests are now recognised as being in what they call stagnation, because they're so overstocked, there's not enough water for them to grow, so they're just held in this stasis. Whereas if you can thin them out, you can actually then allow the trees to grow up. You get separation from the understory, assuming you take all of that biomass out. So you're absolutely right that the killer is the effect of the availability of the fuel, because it can be moist or dry, and you have to think about microclimate, because and also the stocking of trees. And so for gardens, for instance, we thought natives were probably, because we've been testing them, very, very flammable mostly. But if you can keep a native plant very well watered, you're going to improve its likelihood of not being highly flammable, because it's highly moist. And by the same token, if you have some introduced plants and you let them get very dry in summer, they're highly combustible too. So there's this whole, and then there's this really cool trade-off with water, because you say, well, but we're going to have water restrictions. But when you're fighting fires, using water. So using water to keep gardens moist is probably a good use of water compared to trying to dump water out of helicopters.
Yes, thank you very much for the most enjoyable talk. My question was about change. Over the more than 100 years or so, we've seen significant changes in the structure of our landscape and forest, changes in the way we fight fires, changes in the way we manage them. Do we stay and fight, or do we leave early? And on top of all those changes in climate, and these all interact. I just wonder, I think there's probably bigger challenges coming. At the moment, for remote fires, we very much rely on the aerial resources, and that's shared between states, which may have slightly different fire seasons, particularly between hemispheres, where they're completely different fire seasons. These seem to be overlapping as the fire seasons increase. Is this really likely to be a problem? What do we do about it?
So, but what's actually the key question? Like, everything is changing, that's true, but what's the, how am I meant to respond? I'm not certain what, I agree with you. Adaptation, the key thing with adaptation is you've got to be able to be flexible and continual learning. and continual evaluation. And one of the things which I think is really lacking is they do inquiries, but they don't invest, with some exceptions, in science to evaluate the effectiveness of their interventions. So particularly large air tankers dropping fire retardant, which occurred in the World Heritage Area. You know, that's pretty intense stuff, the fire retardant, a lot of phosphorus in it. What was the benefit of that? What were the costs of it? And a lot of this, it's the agencies, it's not quite North Korea, but they want to keep their cards close to their chest. And it should be a lot more open, because that's where, you know, because it doesn't, why would anybody criticise them? Because, you know, they're dealing with unprecedented, you know, that's just not fair to criticise. They're dealing with unprecedented situation. So they're learning by doing, but it's really important to evaluate. So my advice, which was picked up, not that the agencies necessarily follow it, is that there should be much more investment in scientific publication evaluation. So question in the remote area, particularly the effectiveness of prescribed burning, the effectiveness of different sorts of fire management. And then as we build trust with the agencies, and there is some of this research, we've got to start asking the cost effectiveness of it, because it's the, you know, where you're getting bang for your buck. So the West Coast community's simplest thing to do, like burning button grass plains and everything, well, you know, fair enough. But if you really want to protect xenon, best thing to do in Queensland is cut a thumping great fire break through the scrub and maintain it, you know, and have a really good, like I've seen some really nice fire breaks over there, you know, but just do it and invest in that. And, you know, it shouldn't be back to bare earth. It could just be slashed and do a bit of burning on it. And then, you know, that'll protect those towns, no worries. You have them 100 metres wide. I've seen a couple around Strawn. They're really, you know, really impressive, actually.
Keeping here, but I've been studying your work for quite a few years now, Professor Bowman, and I'm a social ecologist, and I've been fascinated by, you know, your lifetime work in this area. Bearing that in mind, and very interesting to see that you're moving towards a broader disciplinary approach to the area. Coming back to practical issues, looking at the whole of landscape management, the state government's broke. Most landowners don't have much money for fuel reduction work. What would you recommend in terms of the three easiest things to do at scale at low cost? And depending on your answer, I might have a supplementary question.
Well, I think I've indicated that. Certainly, I think if people can have the means to have fire shelters, I can't see why they shouldn't have one, because that may save their life. So that just seems bizarre to me. So many exposed houses and communities. The second thing is green fire breaks, I think, are really going to be valuable. So cutting breaks around cities and towns, like in West Coast, it seems no-brainer to me that you could redirect some of their resources and get, you know, the community could understand why that is being done. Queenstown and Zeehan were both threatened by fires last summer. So why not do that? That seems really cost-effective. And the third one, I think, is people's gardens can be something they have agency over. And so it's not something the government be doing. It's just like people should be given help with getting their gardens, green waste, good advice, you know, some practical things that the local government or the state government can help with, you know, so making it easier to get your garden into a situation where your house might survive. So they're probably pretty straightforward things.
Right. Thank you very much.